Well, we are starting a new series in the Gospel of Matthew this morning. This is a book that we will probably be in for several months since it's 28 chapters long and just full of Jesus' teachings. Everything from the famous Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus teaches us to live as citizens of his kingdom here on earth, to all kinds of parables about the kingdom of God, like the pearl of great price and that one about the mustard seed. There's probably even some parables that you haven't heard before or maybe aren't as familiar with that you'll be hearing as well, like the parable of the weeds or the parable of the net that was thrown into the sea. And so you'll get to hear all of those and even a message on the end times. That'll be fun. It's interesting. This is a message that Jesus gave. It's typically called the Olivet Discourse because he preached it from the Mount of Olives. Although it's not really a sermon on the end times. It's not like he was up on that mountain preaching to a crowd of people about the end of the world. He was sitting on a rock having a private discussion with his disciples, and only after they kept pestering about it. And it's funny, the first thing Jesus says to them is, don't get distracted, don't be led astray. A lot of people are going to be saying a lot of stuff. And then Jesus starts to share with them a few things about the end of the age, and we get to listen in on that conversation that he has with his disciples and see what it is that Jesus felt was important for us to know about that time. And so we'll be looking at that as well. So a lot of chapters in this book, the most of any of the four Gospels, in fact, but more importantly than that, a lot of really good content and a lot of really great teachings by Jesus. And so honestly, I don't know how long we're going to be in this book. How old is Margot now? How old? 2.5 months. All right, so maybe we'll get to the point where Margot will be able to come up here and read from the Olivet Discourse by the time we finally get to it. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. But in the meantime, we're going to start the same way that we do with most every series that we do here, and that is with chapter 1 and verse 1. So here we go, the Gospel of Matthew, beginning with chapter 1 and verse 1. Here's what it says: the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Okay, let's stop there. I know we have a long way to go. Be patient. We will get through it, okay? Matthew starts his gospel by calling it the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Doesn't that sound exciting, right? We're kicking things off with a list of names. Sounds about as exciting as counting taxes for a living, which, by the way, is what Matthew was doing, the writer of this gospel, when Jesus first called him to be a disciple. Matthew used to collect taxes for a living for the Roman Empire. Not exactly a person that you would think would be on Jesus' top 12 list, but he was. And that fact will come into play as we look at this genealogy together this morning, because let's just say there's quite a few names on this list that we wouldn't expect to see here. But the names at the very top, we would expect to see. So let's start there. Because even though these are just names, these names really do set the stage for what comes next. Even this word genealogy is significant. In the Greek, the word is genesis, which sounds a lot like Genesis, right? And that's because it is the same word that's used in the Greek version of the Old Testament for the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. And that word means origin or beginning, okay? And so where Genesis chapter 1 tells the story of the beginning of the creation of the world, Matthew chapter 1 tells the story of the beginning of a new creation or a new beginning that is made possible through Jesus Christ, which is the first name on this list, and that's who this genealogy and therefore this entire book is all about, the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Now, we should probably point out right out of the gate here that Christ is not Jesus' last name, okay? Christ means Messiah or anointed one, the promised one, who was spoken of and prophesied about in the Old Testament. And we'll see the significance of that in just a second. Now, the name Jesus is the Greek form of the name Joshua or Yeshua, which means the Lord saves. Okay, and so Matthew begins his gospel basically by saying this is the origin story of the Messiah, okay, or of the promised one who will save his people from their sins, which is exactly what we will hear the angel of the Lord say to Joseph next week after he finds out that his fiancée is with child from the Holy Spirit. Talk about a challenging engagement, right? I mean, forget the stress of planning a wedding or trying to decide on a guest list that everybody can agree upon. Try navigating a virgin birth. See how that goes. Well, we'll see exactly how that goes next week. And you'll see this morning that Matthew does a really good job preparing us for those kinds of moments, those kinds of surprises with some surprising names that he includes in this genealogy. But before we get to those names, there are two more names that Matthew highlights here at the beginning of his book, and that's David and Abraham. Now, David is the name that Matthew highlights the most prominently in this genealogy. So let's say a few things about Abraham first, and then we'll take a look at the significance of David. Now, for Matthew to emphasize at the beginning here that Jesus is the son of Abraham highlights the fact that Jesus is therefore the fulfillment of the covenant that God made with Abraham. And that covenant was this. In Genesis chapter 12, God says to Abraham, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Now, that's a whole sermon right there, right? Seriously, I mean, so many times we are reluctant to step out and do what God is calling us to do because we don't think we have enough information yet, right? God says, go. Like, where, Lord? Where I show you. Where's that? You'll see, right? Well, I don't think I have enough information yet, and I don't think you're listening. Go. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that what? So you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And so by emphasizing the fact that Jesus is the son of Abraham, Matthew is simply pointing out that Jesus is the seed through which all the nations of the earth will be blessed. In fact, not to spoil the ending, but what is the last thing that Jesus says to his disciples? After his resurrection, right before he ascends into heaven, what are Jesus' final words when we get to Matthew chapter 28? Anybody know? Go, right? Go and make disciples of the nations. Leave here from your country and your kindred and your father's house and take this blessing to the nations, this gospel to the nations. And so Matthew is letting us know right here in chapter 1 and verse 1 that this book in part will be about the mission that Jesus has been given to do, to be a blessing to the nations, and also how that mission is lived out in the lives of his disciples as well. So that's Abraham. But what does it mean for Jesus to be the son of David? Well, that's the big one, okay? This is the name that Matthew really wants us to latch on to when we think about Jesus and specifically his purpose in coming to the earth. And let me just show you what I mean here. I'd like to read the last verse of our passage this morning and just point out something that I think will help us to see this whole genealogy in the right context, okay? So after going through this whole list of names, Matthew then says in verse 17, so all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. So 3 sets of 14. Now, aside from the fact that David is mentioned twice in that verse, right? First is the name that concludes the first group of 14 people, and then again, the name that starts the second group of people. The number 14 is also very significant. See, in ancient times, letters served not just to form words, but also had a numeric value as well. And the numeric value of the letters that make up the name David is 14. And guess who's the 14th name on this list? That would be David. And not just David, but Matthew is very careful to identify David in that 14th spot as King David. Okay, so it seems as if Matthew has been using his knack for numbers to highlight one name in particular in this very long list of names, and that is King David. But why David? Why does Matthew go out of his way here to emphasize the fact that out of all of these descendants, Jesus is most importantly the son of David? Well, if you were a first century Jew, you would understand immediately the significance of that name or that phrase, son of David. It's taken from a number of Old Testament passages, including this one from 2 Samuel 7, where God speaks to David through the prophet Nathan after David has expressed the desire to build the temple. Here's what God then says to David. He says, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, so in other words, when you die, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now, in part, that prophecy was fulfilled through David's son Solomon, who built the temple after David passed away. But there's clearly more to this prophecy than what Solomon accomplished, right? Because God says that this particular son of David will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And this is a theme that we see repeated in other Old Testament prophecies as well. Listen to this familiar passage that I'm sure many of you have heard before, and we even sang part of it this morning. Isaiah chapter 9, for to us a child is born, and to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. And then there's Jeremiah 23. For the time is coming, says the Lord, when I will raise up a righteous descendant from King David's line. He will be a king who rules with wisdom. He will do what is just and right throughout the land, and this will be his name. The Lord is our righteousness. And then here's one more, Ezekiel chapter 37. My servant David shall be king over them. Now keep in mind, King David has been dead for nearly 400 years at this time when Ezekiel is writing this prophecy. And yet he's speaking of David as if he's yet to come, right? My servant David shall be king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd. They shall walk in my rules and be careful to obey my statutes. They shall dwell in the land that I gave to my servant Jacob, where your fathers lived. They and their children and their children's children shall dwell there forever, and David, my servant, shall be their prince forever. And so you can see just from those few passages alone that anyone who was familiar at all with the writings of the Old Testament would have recognized right away the significance of the proclamation that Matthew is making here, that the Son of David has come. See, Matthew isn't just giving us a list of names in this genealogy. He's announcing the arrival of the king. And as you'll see as we go through this book together over the next several months, that really is the theme of Matthew's gospel. The coming of the king, the coming of his kingdom, and the implications of that in our lives today. And so let's go through these names now now that we have some context of what we're looking at. And then we'll go back and point out a few things that these names tell us about who Jesus is and what he came to do. Now, keep in mind, this is not a comprehensive list. Okay, not every name in Jesus' family tree is listed here, just the ones that Matthew wanted to highlight for this royal birth announcement. Okay, and one other quick side note, this genealogy is a little bit different than the one we find in the Gospel of Luke. If you've looked at those two, you will notice that some of the names are different. And we're not going to go into all the reasons why that is this morning, other than to say that the simplest explanation is that Luke's genealogy is a physical genealogy and Matthew's genealogy is a legal one. Okay? In other words, Luke's purpose is to show the humanity of Jesus by tracing his biological line back to Adam, where Matthew's purpose is to show Jesus' legal right to the throne. And so he traces the royal line that takes him to King David. So that's the context of what we're about to look at. And I think we're as ready as we'll ever be for this. So here we go. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah is singled out here because he is part of the royal line, okay? Jacob, right before he died, he pronounced a blessing on each of his sons, and the blessing that he pronounced on Judah was, quote, "The scepter shall not depart from him." Okay, so Judah represents the royal line. And then Judah is the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Tamar is the first of 5 women mentioned in this genealogy, and we'll talk about why that's significant in a few minutes. And Perez, the father of Hezron, and Hezron, the father of Ram, and Ram, the father of Amminadab. This is going to be fun. Amminadab, and Amminadab, the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon, the father of Salmon, and Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth. So there's the second and third female members of our genealogy. Rahab, who was a prostitute and a Gentile, and of course Ruth, who was also a Gentile, and a pretty famous one too. We have a whole book of the Bible that tells her story and also ends with the birth of her son Obed, who was the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David the king. So that's the first 14 names on our list. Here's the second. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Now notice that her name is not mentioned, only the fact that she was the wife of another man. But that, of course, is Bathsheba, who David stole from Uriah and then had Uriah killed in order to cover it up. But notice, Matthew isn't trying to cover anything up, right? He's letting us know everything that's happening here through this list of names, and we'll explain why that is when we get to the end. But then David's son Solomon is the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat. Neria is cringing right now. She's like, that's not even close how you pronounce it. I know, I'm doing my best, Neria, okay? We talked about this last night. She was reading through the list. I'm like, I can't say that. I can't pronounce. So I'll do the Jersey accent version. Okay. Jehoshaphat, the father of Urim, and Urim, the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah, the father of Jotham, and Jotham, the father of Ahaz. Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah. Hezekiah, the father of Manasseh. Manasseh, the father of Amos. Amos, the father of Josiah. And Josiah, the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. Now, there's a lot of names there you may not recognize, but those were all kings. Remember, Matthew is tracing the royal line of Jesus, and so that means we're going to have a lot of kings in this list. But again, these aren't all the descendants, so these aren't all the kings. And so it's interesting to see which kings Matthew chooses to highlight here. And we're not going to go through the stories of all these kings this morning, but let me just point out something so you can kind of get a feel for how a Jewish person in the first century might have reacted to this list of names. Okay, because there's both good kings and bad kings on this list. But the way in which they alternate back and forth is what's really interesting because there's no discernible pattern to it. Okay, for instance, Rehoboam, who was a wicked king, was the father of the wicked king Abijah. But Abijah was the father of the good king Asaph, who was the father of the good king Jehoshaphat, who was the father of the wicked king Joram. And so the point is there's no clear pattern of goodness and righteousness in the genealogy of Jesus. In other words, this isn't about blood, this is about grace, right? Grace and sovereignty. God is sovereign over his plan of redemption, and there is nothing or no one who will prevent it from coming to pass. The Son of David will be born, and he will save his people from their sins, despite having a family tree as dysfunctional as this one, right? I mean, there are adulterers and prostitutes and murderers, stories of incest and cover-ups and good kings and bad kings, but through it all, God is faithful to fulfill his promise. Even in times of exile, even when God's people were in captivity in Babylon, and in times of silence as well. As Mark mentioned earlier, God's people experienced 400 years of silence with no new word or no new message from the Lord. The book of Malachi, which we just finished going through together, is the last prophetic book in the Old Testament, followed by 400 years of silence until that silence is broken by a baby's cry and Jesus is born. And that's what this last group of names represents. Most of them are not even in the Bible because they were born during those 400 years. Now, the first few are in the Bible. After the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel, the father of Zerubbabel. And then this is where it goes dark. Okay, 400 years of radio silence. But Matthew had access to records back then that we don't have access to today. And from those records, he lists Zerubbabel as the father of Abiud, and Abiud, the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim, the father of Azor, and Azor, the father of Zadok, and Zadok, the father of Achim, and Achim, the father of Eliud, and Eliud, the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar, the father of Mathan, and Mathan, the father of Jacob, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. Now notice the difference in the wording here at the end. After reading through this long list of names telling us who is the father of whom, at the end when Joseph is mentioned, it's not as the father of Jesus, but as the husband of Mary. And we're not even told here that Mary gave birth to Jesus, but rather that Jesus was born of Mary. It's a subtle thing, but what it communicates to us is the sovereignty of God. That ultimately all of this comes about not because of man's initiative or woman's initiative, but because of God's. Now, why such a crooked tree? Right? I mean, if Matthew's intent was to blow people away with a star-studded royal lineage that would usher in the arrival of the king, the son of David, in regal honor and splendor and majesty, why go with these names? Because remember, these aren't all the names. These are just the ones that Matthew chose to highlight here in his grand announcement as he begins his origin story, his Genesis story of the Christ, the anointed one. So why this list? Well, what we're going to see as we go through this book together is the faithfulness of God in bringing about his plan of salvation, especially in these first two chapters where we see God's hand in everything, from the details of Jesus' birth to the journey of the wise men to the flight from Egypt, all of it orchestrated by a sovereign God whose plan and purpose can never be thwarted despite the enemy's multiple attempts to do so. And so right at the beginning here, Matthew prepares us for that by drawing our attention away from the personal qualifications of the people on this list and instead draw our attention toward the one who is ultimately responsible for all of it. So we might honor and worship and literally stand in awe of the faithfulness of God.